Phoenix. We can tell our story differently. A new perspective. A different look. Greater Phoenix A to Z.
Welcome to the Greater Phoenix A to Z podcast. I'm Allie Bakovic, Vice President of Bioscience Business Development here at GPEC. On this mini-sode series, Arizona Through Their Eyes, team members at GPEC, like myself, will take you behind the scenes with their stories about life and work in Greater Phoenix. So let's dive in. Typically, a GPEC staff member hosts this mini-sode series, but for this episode, we're switching things up. Today, I've invited Kenzy to join me on the podcast to step into the interviewer's seat. She'll be asking me questions about my career journey in research and economic development, as well as any questions she may have as a student navigating her own path. I am honored to introduce today's podcast host, Kenzy Moustafa, a neuroscience undergraduate student at Arizona State University, whom I've had the privilege of mentoring. And beyond our mentor-mentee relationship, she is also a trusted ally in scientific research and a friend. Passionate about neurodegenerative diseases, particularly Alzheimer's, Kenzy aims to contribute to groundbreaking treatments. She currently works as a research assistant in a visual cognition lab where she helps with data collection, analysis, and literature review. Thanks for joining us today, Kenzy.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and have you answer some of my questions. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Can you give us a brief overview of your background? So where did you go to school? What did you study? And how did that lead to where you are today?
So actually, I was initially just, I grew up really strong in science and technical areas. Wasn't really the greatest, history lessons or English and literature and anything like that. So I always knew I was going to do something STEM related. Now I was actually slated to be a mathematician because I'm actually better at math than science. Mm-hmm. But when I was a senior in high school, I started exploring, what jobs do you get in math, right? Mm-hmm. And personally for me, they were just a little boring. So I started exploring science instead. And what I really, really liked about science is that it's just so much more creative and requires more of a critical thinking mind because it really pushes you to drive into your curiosity to fix a problem. Mm-hmm. So I liked that angle to it. So with that, I ended up, instead of going, say, the actuarial mathematician route, I ended up completely switching. And I got my undergrad degree in biomolecular engineering at the Milwaukee School of Engineering. So it was very cool. That's an engineering school predominantly. And so you're surrounded by all different kinds of engineers, software, electrical, mechanical, all that kind of, thing. So I could learn that language, but then also the biomolecular language and be able to bridge the two. So that's really where I started learning on how to kind of use scientific principles, but then explain them and translate them to the layman who doesn't know, anything about a biomolecule, say. From there, I ended up, after undergrad, you only have a bachelor's degree, right? Mm-hmm. So to get the really cool jobs, you need a master's or a Ph.D. So I ended up transitioning. I needed a break from school. I just wanted to get real world experience. Mm-hmm. So I ended up getting hired onto a contract research organization called PPD at the time. They since have been acquired by Thermo Fisher. And I learned a lot. I was working in GMP laboratories, so I learned a lot about quality standards, quality data, that kind of thing, and standard operating procedures, right? That was okay. It was just it was a little too cookie cutter for me, right? When you follow an SOP, it's very, step by step, and you have to follow those standards in a GMP lab. So you couldn't really do a lot of the flexible research space. And so from there, I was okay, I need to switch jobs. And then all the jobs I was looking into required a master's or a PhD. And so I was okay, this is kind of a good ticker for me to tell me, okay, you need to go get a graduate degree. So I ended up getting a big scholarship and a stipend through George Mason University. And I chose that university specifically because they have biosafety level 3 biocontainment labs. Nice. So I was really interested in infectious disease and biodefense research. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going out there. My formal degree is in microbiology, infectious disease research, and then I'm trained as a virologist. So I started working as a virologist in those biocontainment labs, and then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic hits. So that was a big wild ride to kind of experience that. I hate using the word front lines because it's right. It's not I was interacting directly with infected patients, but it was more the front lines just inside of the research lab. So my thesis was funded 50% by the National Institutes of Health and then 50% by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So I could kind of toggle between the public health realm as well as the biodefense, and I thought that was really cool to see the intersection of both. After that, I moved into some defense intelligence acquisition. So really just looking as to what are our, peer adversarial countries, what are they publishing in science and what pathogens are they using, and basically reporting that up to the Department of Defense. And then I ended up from there, I got hired by Deloitte Consulting. So then they contracted me out underneath their federal health initiatives. So I was working with the CDC, NIH, and DoD on some scientific policy, data management practices, helping them kind of establish, those kinds of standards as well for their grantees. And then I decided, once I moved to Phoenix, I wanted to look, I did the whole federal consulting realm, and then I decided, I want to kind of figure out what I could do for my local community, and then that's where I started networking, and then had found this role at GPEC. So decided to kind of take it from federal level down to, the state and local level.
Nice. So you spent a significant amount of time working in a lab, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but what kind of research were you involved in, and what was the experience like?
So in order to become an engineer, you actually have to engineer something. So people don't realize that when they go, either when they're starting in engineering school or people who are dealing with engineering graduates, in order to be qualified as an engineer, you have to actually produce something from scratch. So my senior design project, which every single senior in engineering school has to go through and complete, it's basically like a mini thesis, if you can kind of think about it that way. So I was working with other students on a team, and we ended up developing a process to basically extract this biomolecule called chitosan from crustacean cells, which is basically, it's a biological compound that you can extract that chitosan from and then enhance wound healing from there. Wow. So that is sort of almost like a dual purpose thing too, right? Mm-hmm. You could treat patients with that product, or it really helps with the war fighter as well to expedite that healing out, say on the battlefield, for instance. And then, as an undergrad, I pursued a lot of summer undergraduate research experiences. So I ended up having a couple out with University of Minnesota, Virginia Tech, different projects. So that's kind of where I was getting a lot of diverse research lab experience. And then during my graduate degree, this was my most fun research. So it was, like I said before, it was at the intersection between medical countermeasure, antiviral research in the public health realm, and then also at the same time kind of evaluating viral mutagenesis research for biodefense purposes. Mm-hmm. So my thesis was basically centered around elucidating phosphorylation effects on a non-structural protein within alpha virus genomes. And so these alpha viruses, they're on the federal select agent pathogen list for the CDC. So they're basically considered pathogens that could pose a severe threat to humans and animals and could be used for dual-use purposes. Mm-hmm. So potentially nefarious, So my research basically showed that removing certain phosphorylation sites within that alpha virus genome completely kills the virus's ability to replicate. So these genomic sites could then be used to develop alpha viral vaccines or targets for medical countermeasures. And so that lab work was really fun because you really get to work with your hands. And so it's basically like cooking and following a recipe kind of, but until something goes wrong, right? So then you really get the opportunity to lean into your critical thinking mind and challenge yourself to figure out how to get an experiment to work, but also, is it producing high quality results? Are these results trustworthy? That kind of thing.
So many people assume that, a career in science means staying in research forever. And yeah, but your path took a different turn. So what inspired you to step outside of the lab and explore economic development?
Yeah, so, I mentioned it before where I was working as a virologist right when the COVID-19 pandemic had hit, right? Mm-hmm. And so in those biocontainment labs, that means strapping on a Tyvek suit all day, every day, wearing a respirator on your head, and just hoping and praying that you don't need to use the bathroom so you don't have to garb out and then garb back in, right? So that lab life gets a little old, and cumbersome and tedious. So on top of that too, I did all this work. I was publishing my first author research paper, which is a big deal in the research world, right? Because you're the lead scientist on that project. It's basically 90% of the research findings are your work. So it's supposed to be a big deal. For me, that got published and it wasn't good enough for me. I was like, I put in so much blood, sweat, and tears into this just for it to be a paper like as a URL link online. And just I hope someone reads this and can find it useful one day, So I just needed to see more direct impact of my work out in the real world, outside of the lab walls, kind of. So that's where, I moved into sort of, okay, well, doing the consulting work at the federal level, I can be the scientist in the room that can use that critical thinking mind that I gained and that toolbox of skills that I acquired during my graduate thesis to then end up making a change on the federal level at, the highest level you can get. So improving the quality of data, providing guidance to the researchers who are in the labs and giving them guidance as to here's the standards for this high quality data. This is how you should evaluate it. And here's the policies that will help drive that forward. So that was where, I just thought that was a little bit better fit for me. But then at the same time, as a federal consultant and working as a contractor, you can only do so much unless you're an actual federal employee, right? Like you can give them the tools and the solutions to different problems, but then it's on the federal government to basically implement those, right? So when I had moved to Greater Phoenix, I wanted to really embrace the community and make it my home. So I leaned into figuring out how I could transition into a role at the local level so that I can make an impact in my community right in my backyard. And I thought that would be a little bit more passion driven for me. So I basically, honestly, when I moved to Phoenix, I started networking at all the local AZ Bio events, Venture Cafe events. And, I had met some folks, most notably the Flynn Foundation folks as well. And so one thing had led to another, and this role had opened up at GPEC, and I just took a leap of faith and I applied.
Nice.
So it was really fun. So I mentioned that to say that, that duration of networking only took me like a month and a half, 2 months to really just kind of find these events, just kind of go to them, even though I didn't know a single person, just go to them and just be willing to talk to people, and you just never know what might happen.
Yeah, so now you're playing a key role at GPEC, helping to grow Greater Phoenix's bioscience ecosystem. Can you tell us more about your current role and what excites you most about the work that you're doing?
Definitely. So like I said before, right,
Yeah.
I took a leap of faith. I found this role at GPEC, right? And I just remember one of my interviews with Chris Camacho, the president and CEO of GPEC. We were sitting in this very room, and I had told him, listen, if you are looking for someone who has business acumen, I'm not it. That's not my background. My background is strictly science. But if, so it's up to you what you're looking for. And he said, no, I don't need someone who knows all the business, principles, knows all the economic development principles. I really just do need a scientist to be able to kind of speak to these companies. So that's sort of where I play a role, a big significant role, is that I can be sort of that translator between the companies who are very science and technical, and I've worked in the labs, so I can understand the infrastructure that they need, and then I can kind of translate that into my economic development team and with the teams within the regions and everything to kind of find, the solutions to what these science companies need, right? So I work on identifying out-of-market companies, both in high opportunity areas like cell and gene therapies or contract research organizations, to help fill our market gaps and also sort of project where research trends are going and where the hot ticket items are as well. And so then I offer ways for these companies to both get connected scientifically to our local ecosystem, as well as whether it's a small startup or a larger big pharma conglomerate, finding them the right infrastructure and the right sort of benefits within the region to help support their business operations. And so what excites me the most is that I can be very creative with this role. I've been given a lot of flexibility at GPEC to kind of run with the role and pursue the mission. And so I'm able to get some, unique irons in the fire to help achieve that mission too. And what really drives me is the job creation aspect. So I really love that this job, bringing in out of market companies here and establishing like a local business operations, that creates jobs. So that students coming out of all of our universities here, they have options to choose from to launch their careers. So they can look outside of Arizona if they want to, but they don't have to. And so that's really where the passion kind of sits in for me, because I didn't feel like I had that, back in Wisconsin after Milwaukee School of Engineering. I just really thought like, I have to leave in order to kind of have any sort of career trajectory. So I want to give that to our Arizona students.
Makes sense. And so Greater Phoenix's bioscience sector, it's been expanding rapidly. So what are some of the biggest trends or opportunities that you're seeing in the ecosystem right now?
So what really is interesting to me about our region, and it's awesome, is that Greater Phoenix is very focused on translational research. So students have the opportunity to get a job in the research field where they're not just publishing papers. They're actually seeing tangible outcomes to their research. So whether it's developing, real world tangible tech like a medical device or improving patient outcomes, Greater Phoenix researchers here, they take the bench to bedside concept very seriously. So where you'll see it in other markets and other states is that, the researcher reputation is all driven upon just publishing papers and getting more grant funding. Here, it's not like that. It's very much so, okay, what's the end goal here for the patient? How is this getting to the patient? And the research here takes that very seriously. So for me, I think a career in research here in the region can be scientifically challenging, but it's also very rewarding.
And so for researchers and scientists that might be considering careers beyond the lab like you, what advice would you give for exploring different pathways?
So first, I'd say to ask yourself, what do you want your days to look like? So do you want to be in a lab and working with your hands? Or do you want to have a more outward-facing role that interacts with people where you're having meetings and building relationships? Or do you want to work for clients and have to deliver on contracts and proposals and such like that, right? So it just depends. Like asking yourself that question will start to point you in the right direction of what pursuits you should consider. And so I think many people get distracted by roles or titles, but it's really your day-to-day that drives your quality of life, and then that thereby impacts your passions. I'd also say that just because a role that you have in mind doesn't exist, it doesn't mean that it can't exist. So don't be hesitant in leveraging your network to create the role you want with the organization you support. So just all in all, don't be afraid to try. The lab can always be there if you want to go back to it. So don't be afraid to just leave the lab and try something new, and leverage your network to find the right people in those decision maker roles so that you can pitch to them, hey, I think you have a need for this role. This is how I could fill that. What do you think?
So one challenge for students like me and, recent graduates is figuring out how to get their foot in the door. So what advice would you have for students that want to tap into their local ecosystem to find their first job out of college?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that a lot of students, they get a little nervous trying to figure out what to do, right, after they graduate. They get a little nervous. Their network is small, right, because, you just started building it up probably the last 2 years of your degree program, so it's pretty small already. Now, what I would say is don't be afraid to reach out to people directly and ask them to go for coffee or lunch, and then if they're not willing to do that, ask them to just meet virtually on a call instead, right? So that face-to-face interaction can be everything for someone who's seeking their next role and trying to launch out of labs. So a couple, examples here for students right here in the Greater Phoenix region would be Venture Cafe happens every Thursday evening out at the Phoenix Bioscience Core at the 850 PBC building that was built by Wexford. And so that's from 4 to 7. It's free to attend, and there's a lot of people that show up. I mean, there's probably 200 people that show up weekly just to get those insights, that free programming, that intel, and they have a whole networking hour too. So you can meet people really easily that way. Another one is that ASU and Mayo Clinic have a health alliance. So knowing that this exists is, I think, critical for students so that they know what's kind of at at their hands and in their backyard. So being able to leverage where you're currently at and whatever departments at Arizona State University to get in with that alliance, that could be helpful as well. So it's really just, I encourage students to try to just do their homework, figure out what is here, put the pieces together, and then just start reaching out cold. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And who cares, you know? You can have, if you reach out to 100 people cold and you only get 5 responses back, that's still 5 responses that you got back that you never would have if you didn't try.
And so, as someone that's made a big transition in your career, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned along the way?
I would say, and this might be a hot take for other researchers and scientists for me to say this, but it doesn't matter how many degrees you've had or how much work experience you've had. So you're never going to be the expert in the room. You just won't. There will always be someone smarter than you or more of an expert on a particular topic than you are. So my biggest lesson or advice is to really get to know those around you and realize their strengths. So anything you're trying to achieve, it takes a team. It always does. You can't do big goals and big things by yourself. So using everyone's individualized strengths around you can help make the overall mission happen. So it's not about your credentials or how smart you are or how many research papers you've published. It's really how you use your knowledge to make the difference.
Nice.
So thank you, Kenzy, for joining us today.
thank
I really
you.
appreciated the conversation. Thank you for listening today, everyone. If you liked what you heard, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast listening app and rate us 5 stars, or you can leave a review of the show. To keep up with what's happening in Greater Phoenix, follow us at Greater Phoenix on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, or at GPEC on X. Until next time, be safe and well.